What's up, my wizards? It's Dev. Mtg, we like it a magic, and it's Brewer's Choice today. Usually, I leave what decks we do up to my patrons, but every now and again, I like to step in and give you a deck I'm really excited about. And today, Discard. This has been one of my favorite archetypes since the days when the rack was a relatively new card, so I got a lot of love for Discard, so much so that I couldn't decide which deck I wanted to bring you. So I'm going to use this opportunity to bring you one of our patented double deck techs, because I got a little something for my budget brethren and a little something for the competitive crowd. As usual, budget deck goes first. I like this budget deck. It's a mono black discard deck that kind of takes a page from the book of Legacy Discard. Also a mono black discard deck that's kind of low to the ground, plays a little bit like an aggro deck, but also plays some discard elements. A good analog currently to that deck is mono blue tempo. It's an interesting analogy. Basically, instead of countering spells that are targeted at your small guys or big threats that outclass your small guys, you'll proactively remove them from your opponent's hand rather than having to hold up mana to counterspell them. That said, though, the deck also borrows a little bit from the playbook of the modern 8-rack deck, because we have 8 different versions of our sort of win-conditioned discard payoff. We're playing 4 Fell Spectre and 4 in Raider's Wake. So I guess you could call it 8 Wake. Raider's Wake takes advantage of the fact that we are a low-to-the-ground aggro deck. So this is kind of the top-of-the-curve finish for the deck. If we can just make them discard a couple of cards after we get our Wake out, well, that's 2-4 damage. And if we have a Fell Spectre 2 on the battlefield, then we're really piling up damage quick for every card we make them discard. And it helps add up to 20 quickly. See, the philosophy here is that we start the game with a 1-drop, maybe a couple of small creatures, get in a few damage, and then let these effects officially finish off the game once we've decimated our opponent's hand. But the other most important cards in this mono black discard deck are the ones that actually make them discard cards. So we're going to play 4 whole copies of Drill Bit, possibly the most important discard piece in the deck, but we'll also work in 4 copies of Vicious Rumors and 4 Arterial Flow. Now, Drill Bit is another card that benefits from playing a bunch of creatures on the lower end of the curve. We're already doing that for Raider's Wake, and same philosophy works really well when it comes to actually casting Drill Bit for 1 mana and making it technically better than Thoughtseize. It's pretty easy to cast Drill Bit on turn 2 in this deck. All you have to do is attack with a 1-drop. But you could also just cast Vicious Rumors on turn 2. That triggers Spectacle and makes them discard a card, so once you get your Drill Bit for 1 mana on turn 2 along with Rumors, you are just pulling apart their hand really fast. I like the Rumors plus Drill Bit play a lot on turn 2. It's actually pretty good against aggro decks. That's a deck we don't usually have that much game against, but especially if we had the pleasure of going first that game, we are ripping their hand apart and punishing anyone that decided to mulligan more than once. But I can't leave out Arterial Flow. If you've got a vampire on the battlefield, this will trigger Spectacle too. So for 4 mana, you can go Arterial Flow into Drill Bit and take every last card out of their hand a lot of the time. And remember that even if they don't have any cards in their hand, you can still cast Arterial Flow. It's not a big deal. And if you have a vampire out, they'll still take the damage, you'll still drain the life. That's relevant occasionally. Arterial Flow is also really good with Fell Spectre or Raider's Wake, or if you have both of them out, you're just getting all of the damage off of discards. And, again, if you have a vampire out, this can do as much as like 6 damage really easily. We're not quite done. Let's get into the creatures here, some of which are on the lower end of the curve and some of which are on the higher end of the curve. But I've been talking about these small guys all video already because, again, we've got to make sure that we trigger Raider's Wake or that we hit Spectacle when needed to. So we need some small guys that can get through in the early game. I'm playing 4 copies of Vicious Conquistador in the deck, along with 4 Pilfering Imp and 4 Burglar Rat. Now, Conquistador is a nice pick because this will get through guaranteed damage on an attack step even when blocked, so that'll trigger Spectacle on turn 2, even if your opponent was able to play a 1-drop or a 2-drop or whatever. So that can be really important sometimes if all you're trying to do is hit Drill Bit, so this definitely takes priority in the 1-drop department. But Pilfering Imp is pretty good at triggering Spectacle on turn 2. It basically gets free attacks against a lot of the decks in this format that aren't mono blue, basically. So that said, Drill Bit on turn 2 isn't too hard off of a turn 1 Pilfering Imp, and if you absolutely need to, you can sack that same Pilfering Imp later and get another card out of your opponent's hand. Not only is it on theme, but it triggers Spectacle and Raider's Wake pretty easily. And of course, Burglar Rat. This could be Kitesail Freebooter, but that doesn't actually make them discard a card, so you won't get any extra value off of Fell Spectre or Raider's Wake. With Burglar Rat, this will just be worth a free 2 to your opponent sometimes when it comes down, but it's still good in the early game. Even though your opponent gets to pick what they discard, it's not that big of a deal. You still get a body on the battlefield that can attack, trigger Spectacle if it does get through, but at least trigger Raider's Wake. Even if it doesn't get through, you just have to attack with a creature to trigger that. So sometimes Burglar Rat will be good for that. Sometimes it's just a chump blocking body, but at the end of the day, gets a card out of your opponent's hand, and that's what we're looking for. Now up here at the top end of the curve, we do have a couple of bigger creatures. I'm playing 3 copies of Vampire Sovereign and 1 copy of Urgoros because I just couldn't resist playing an Orgoros. This is basically exactly the deck you want to play him in. It's a budget mono black discard deck, so he's perfect for it, even at 6 mana. I'm a little skittish about playing a 6-drop in the deck though, so I'm only playing the 1 copy, but it's pretty sweet. If you can ensure that you clear the board of big threats, or at least keep the board clear of big threats by forcing your opponent to discard all that stuff, then Urgoros will usually go uncontested in the sky, and even if your opponent's out of cards in their hand, you'll still generate card advantage off of it. So I do think he has a place in the deck, but Vampire Sovereign is often actually the better creature. Even though this isn't a Hypnotic Spectre in any way, like Urgoros is, this is still a nice, fat, in-the-air threat that usually benefits from the same reason, or for the same reasons that Urgoros does. This is at the top of the curve, and usually our opponent won't get their top-of-the-curve creatures. They'll have to discard them before they can ever hope to get to them. But we do get our top-of-the-curve creatures, so Vampire Sovereign can finish a game off pretty quick, deal a little bit extra damage, so it's reaching that way. And it goes pretty well with Fel Spectre damage from our little guys, to help add up to 20. But if it does need to attack, it can get through pretty well. Defends the air sometimes if we need to do that, and can even catch us back up in the life department. So there's a lot to like about Vampire Sovereign at the top end of the curve, in specifically a deck that's this budget. Here's the mana base. It's pretty simple, you know. A deck that's only 1 color. You don't have much to worry about. 20 swamps, 4 Memorial to Folly, which is a very important quote-unquote spell in this deck, because it's going to be able to get you back a Vampire Sovereign, get another ETB trigger from that, an Urgoros when it inevitably dies to removal at some point in the game, Fel Spectre you can get back, make him discard another card, and get your engine back running. So you need Memorial to Folly. It's just a great recursive piece that we basically get to play for free in the mana base. Now, there's no board for this deck. There will be one for the competitive deck, but this is more of a best-of-1 type deck. But, of course, if you wanted to build a sideboard, it's not too hard. Just put Duress in there. It should probably go. Divest could maybe be in there. You need a sweeper like Cry of the Carnarium. You've got a lot of options in the sideboard if you did want to build it. It's not too tough to figure out. But this is more of a best-of-1 deck that's pretty good at laddering quickly in the early phases of Arena. Now here are your power rankings. A final score of 55. Fairly low, but again, the deck is less than $10, but comes together pretty well. You know, we've got a lot of different discard elements, and again, if you get the right combination of cards in the early game, and it's not too hard to get them in your opening hand, then you can just completely eviscerate. I was going to say eradicate, eracervate your opponent's hand super fast and kind of leave them with no defenses. There's a ton of control decks in this format, and slower or more tempo-oriented decks that we can just methodically tear apart with surgical precision. You know, we can take the counterspells and removal elements, the sweepers, out of Control's hand and leave them defenseless. We can take the counterspells and bigger threats like Tempest Gen out of Mono Blue's hand. Decks like Blue-Green Nexus, we completely tear apart. We leave them with no hope. All we gotta do is take the Nexus out of there, and what are we gonna do? So we have a lot of options against some really good decks in this format right now. We might not have all the game in the world against lower to the ground, more aggro decks, like, for instance, Mono White, White Blue. There's a couple of decks that can best us in those departments. But if you're up against slower decks more often, again, as per Control, this thing performs really admirably against. So give it a shot if you're having trouble with that deck. But again, specifically, this works really good against the Nexus type decks in the format if you're not on Arena. But even if you are on Arena, this works pretty well against the tempo decks. But on to the big dog. We're going Grixis for this competitive deck. It might look weird to some, but adding red and blue actually gives us a couple of very specific cards that allow us to increase the power level of this deck by kind of a whole lot all at once, you know, which is exactly what we're obviously trying to do for a competitive deck. With Grixis, we're allowed to play, you know, fewer bad cards. I don't know how a better way to sugarcoat it, you know. We get to cut things like Vicious Rumors and Arterial Flow and even Raider's Wake in favor of just better cards with a higher overall power level, and there's nothing wrong with that. All that said, though, I'm actually keeping Fel Spectre in this deck as a whole playset. I just want a payoff for discard. But even if this doesn't ever give us the payoff, aside from when it first enters the battlefield, it still has a good ETB trigger that gets a card out of their hand and presents a threat on board that, if nothing else, can chump block in the air for us. So there is a lot to like about Fel Spectre, even in a competitive deck. I do think it's the better choice than Raider's Wake, especially in a more controlling deck like we're playing that's not going to be attacking more often. But if it sits on the board more than a turn or two, you're almost sure to get extra damage out of it, and I really like having some sort of discard payoff. Now, discard is very often its own reward, but if we can get 2, 4, 6 extra damage and effectively make this our Megrim, if you remember that card, then I think that we should do that and utilize it in this competitive deck. But pretty much every other card is different from the first deck. Now, I say pretty much because we're still playing Drill Bit. Now, we're not attacking very often in the early game here, but we've still got a multitude of ways to trigger Spectacle as early as turn 2 if we absolutely have to, so I'm not shy about playing Drill Bit. Like I said earlier, I might play this even if we couldn't reliably trigger Spectacle, because Coercion for 3 mana still takes away an awful lot of mid and late game options from some decks right now. Nexus of Fate, Hydroid Krasis, Wilderness Reclamation, and the list goes on and on. There's a ton. Teferi, Lyra Dawnbringer. There are a lot of cards that you can get, even if you cast this for 3 mana, to where you kind of don't feel too bad about it. But we can still cast this for 1 an awful lot of the time in this deck, even without attacking so often. But now on to the reasons why I decided to add colors to this deck. Now, I think one of the better reasons to add red to the deck overall is Angrath. We're playing just a couple of copies of it, but I think it's a much better top-of-the-curve tool than either Vampire Sovereign, obviously, or Urgaros. This is on theme, it makes our opponents discard cards, but it's good for +2 damage every single turn by ticking it up, even if our opponent doesn't have cards in their hand. So after a while, it will end the game, especially compounded with Fel Spectre damage, random attack damage, and stuff like that. 2 damage piles up really, really quick, but if our opponent does have any cards in their hand, obviously, this gets much better. But it doesn't stop there. This also has pretty good value against aggro and mid-range decks that play a lot of lower to the ground, small-ish creatures. We can just basically use this as a removal tool against them, and if we ever tick it up all the way to ultimate, it'll kill our opponent outright a lot of the time. But the Mad Cow isn't the only reason to want to add red to the deck, not by a long shot, because we also get Carnival Carnage in this thing. This is a great card just in this meta period, just outside of a discard deck right now, but you obviously want all 4 copies in a discard deck because you just get to play Blightning. That's awesome, and if you have a Fel Spectre out, this just does all of the damage in the world, is 7 damage if they actually have to discard the 2 cards. So yes, this is a great way sometimes to finish a game off, or just make them discard their last 2 cards. That's crazy, but the Carnival half is good too in this deck. If you need it to trigger Spectacle, you can absolutely enable Spectacle with this for just 1 mana, so long as they have a creature out. So that's pretty sweet right there. But this can also kill really low to the ground stuff. It's good against mono blue. It kills Pteramander on sight very early in the game. Same thing with Storm Tamer, Mistcloaked Herald, white 1-drops, a lot of those that this kills. Lawnmower Elves, Fanatical Firebrands, or at least make them sacrifice their Firebrand at an inopportune time. There's just so much play on just the first half of this card right now. And for what it's worth, it helps us add up damage to 20. It's just 1 damage. That's 5% of their life total. They can't do that too often. So there's just so much to like about either half of this card, and it's on theme, playing all 4. But there are great reasons to add blue to the deck as well, like Thought Erasure. This is maybe the single best discard spell in the entire format, bar none, so I can't leave it out, of a discard deck. Again, this is a good way of bringing up the overall power level. We're not just playing like, chintzy, kind of dumb discard spells like Vicious Rumor that don't really have that much value. This has a ton of value. On turn 2, you can pull the best card out of their hand, and you get a Surveil to help fix your next couple of draws. So, yes to Thought Erasure. If we're adding blue and red, this is honestly one of the single best reasons to do so, bar none. But we also get Pteramander. Kind of a weird looking pick, but this deck does need a slightly higher density of threats than it has, let's be honest. And Pteramander's a great way of getting just a 5/5 for really cheap in the late game. We're playing 21 pretty low cost instants and sorceries in this deck, so our graveyard fills up pretty fast with, again, instants and sorceries, so we can adapt Pteramander for just a mana or 2 really quick, and suddenly our opponent's out of cards, completely out of gas in their hand, hand, including removal for Pteramander, and suddenly they're staring down a 5/5 flyer. So that's one reason I'm playing it. But Pteramander is also really, really good, just like Pilfering Imp in the first deck, at enabling Spectacle on turn 2 for Drill Bit. It's just another way of making that happen, but it's also a good late game way to finish things. But putting it all together, it's nice to add blue and red to black because you also get to play Nicol Bolas. You're probably waiting on this. This is much, much better in pretty much every way than a card like Fel Spectre. One great thing about playing Nicol is that, unlike the first deck, we have a really, really meaty flying threat that'll help finish off games, especially if we can strip our opponent of all of their cards. This is much better than Vampire Sovereign at just taking over the air. You'd be surprised how much difference 1 point of power makes. If we needed to in the late game, we can just transform it. We can get a Planeswalker out of this, and suddenly we can start drawing cards if we're either behind or just on a board where we have to draw cards, For one reason or another, if we need gas, this can give it to us, but more likely, this is going to just destroy stuff and then reanimate it, or reanimate any creatures we've made them discard up to that point. You just really couldn't ask for a better finisher than Nicol Bolas, and it obviously goes in a discard deck. Look what it makes him do when it enters the battlefield. So, of course it's on theme, yeah, but it's also just a massively impressive finisher that's going to end the game for you a lot of the time. But we're not quite done here, because red actually affords us a nice little burn package so we can play some removal here. So with that in mind, I'm playing 4 Shock, 4 Lightning Strike, and a copy of Banefire. It doesn't necessarily go with the other removals. It's not going to kill anything in the early game for the most part, but Banefire is a nice way to finish things off all at once against control decks, which can sometimes be bothersome, so Banefire gives us a way to do that. But if we have to kill a creature with it, we can do that. And sort of at the floor of the card, if we absolutely must enable Spectacle right then and there, Banefire can do it for 2 mana. So there's that, but for the most part, this is to finish things off all in one punch against control decks. Shock and Lightning Strike, I like them in this deck because they afford us a removal opportunity to clean off the board. Obviously, we're not going to get every card out of our opponent's hand in the early game. That's just not going to happen. They're probably going to land a threat or two, so we can help, Shock and Lightning Strike can help keep the board clear. But they can also enable Spectacle for Drill Bit. That's a very important part of these cards, and they're not entirely dead against control like, say, a Cast Down or a Moment of Craving would be. As a matter of fact, I especially like having these in control because just like the first deck, we're ostensibly trying to count to 20 in every Magic deck that we play, but especially in these because we're playing, a bunch of stuff like Fel Spectre that does incremental damage. We're trying to get a swing or 2 through with Nicol Bolas. We're doing 2 damage at a time with Angrath. We've got Carnival Carnage to snipe them for a damage. So again, we're trying to add it all up to 20, and having this burn package goes a long way in making sure we can do that. But to finish the deck off here, we're playing a couple of copies of Theater of Horrors. This is our card advantage engine. We desperately need one in this deck, especially once we run our opponent out of gas. They're in top deck mode. Sometimes we're in top deck mode around that time too. So a lot of the exchanges in this deck are 1-for-1. So keeping that in mind, we have to be able to outpace our opponent, especially when we've got them right where we want them. And Theater of Horrors is pretty good at doing that. Any burn spell will help trigger Spectacle, help you get extra cards from Theater, but that said, you can just, once you have the mana, use Theater to get access to the cards that it's banked for you. So, again, it takes a little bit of mana to do that, but this deck will routinely get to the late game. If you don't have a Nicol Bolas out, you don't have a whole heck of a lot to do with your mana or your board state, and Theater of Horrors can really fix that problem and give you access to extra cards that it's banked, and just be a mana sink that does damage. Again, trying to add up to 20 in this deck, so even 1 damage from this every turn will add up. Now, there's 24 lands in this deck. We've got 18 black sources, because that's mostly what we're aiming for. But we've also got parity with the other sources. 14 red and 14 blue to make sure that we can get to Thought Erasure or burn spells or whatever we're trying to get to on turn 2 or 3. Let's say we need Theater on turn 3, plenty of red sources to get there. But we're mostly concentrating on black here. Here's the sideboard. There's the Duress that you probably expected to see. And yeah, you could probably shoehorn a copy or 2 of this into the main deck, but cards like Thought Erasure are just much, much better. But that said, when you do come across decks like Control or decks like Nexus, you'll definitely put in the Duress as well as the negates. You want all the negates against those. Obviously, adding blue to the deck, allows us to play these sideboard counterspells, and that's usually one of the most attractive reasons to play blue in just about any deck. Add blue to any deck, and that's certainly the case here, so we'll at least play the 3 copies of negate. Also against Control, even though we have a pretty good Game 1 matchup against them, I've still got some slots on the board devoted to them. We've got a copy of Banefire to go with the main deck copy of Banefire, in case we need that, plus an Argel's Bloodfast as another card draw engine. Our life total means absolutely nothing to us against Esper for the most part, so this will come in and draw us 3-4 extra cards over game, and that'll usually make a huge difference. Aside from that, though, we've also got a couple of copies of the Eldest Reborn, one of the newest cards as far as me building this deck goes. And it could go in the main, honestly. This is pretty good at getting back cards that you've made them discard at some point in the game, and it can keep the board clear of stuff that you have let slip through. So I like the idea of the Eldest Reborn, but it mostly works well against mid-range decks. That's why you see it in the sideboard here instead of the main deck. Aside from that, we've got a Bedevil to take out any big threats that we let slip through, especially against mid-range decks that play a lot of big threats. Bedevil can be a good saving grace, ironically. But there's also Cry of the Carnarium, which is maybe the most important card in the entire sideboard. Again, maybe our worst matchup is an aggro deck, a mono-white deck or a blue-white deck, even a mono-red deck. We struggle against because they'll stick threats very, very early that we don't have all the removal for. Yeah, in this deck we've got Shock and Lightning Strike to help keep the board clear early, but sometimes it's just not enough, and if they get too ahead of us on board, they're going to kill us pretty much every time. So Cry the Carnarium can at least help stop the bleeding. But here are your power rankings for the competitive deck here. A final score of 66, much better defensively and much better ultimately at finishing the game because we've got a piece like Nicole Bolas. The deck greatly benefits from a card advantage engine, plus we've got better threats in both Nicole and Terramander in this deck, and a much more diverse, or I should say present in the first place, removal package that also doubles as a burn suite, so the deck is reasonably versatile and has a lot of different ways it can go about winning a game. But with all that, I'm pretty sure that I'm done profiling these two decks for you. You know, had to kind of run through these because double deck techs, I don't want to be here for an hour and a half, and you probably don't either. But I hope that you enjoyed these two, you know. They actually are good for what they're good for. In terms of budget decks, if you're spending less than $10 on a deck, you know, that mono black deck is actually really good. You know, it doesn't look like it plays a whole lot of good stuff, but it all comes together, it all becomes cohesive, and it runs pretty well once you do put all those parts together. But as far as the competitive deck, a lot more methodical for the most part, a little bit slower and more controlling, but once it's in position to finish the game, again, it's a little bit better at actually doing so. So pick and choose, and let me know which one you like more down there in the sideboard. Let me know how you do with it, and if you did want to order either one of these decks, I'll leave deck list links to them in the description box down there. You can click those links, go over to TCG Play, they sponsor you, boy! You can get the decks at the lowest prices on the whole interwebs. So if you just want to look at the deck lists in a better format than 20-minute fat guy talking to you, then just click the links in the description, go over there and check them out. Also, like the video, even though there weren't jokes or cats, there were very serious decks, and I like to think that's what I do best. But I know how much you guys like jokes and cats. But in any case, I hope you still find the time to like the video. Subscribe if you haven't done it yet, because there will be jokes and cats in future videos, I'm sure of that. And hit the bell for the notifications. Also, if you really like your dude, you can go over to the Patreon. I'll leave a link in the description, and throw $1 in there to help vote on what decks we do. Almost every day, except for Brewer's Choice, but pretty much every video I put up, aside from these, gets voted on. So if you want to be part of the voting process, and just be a part of democracy itself, then throw $1 into the Patreon jar, and I'll also let you know what decks we do 24 hours in advance. But aside from that, pretty sure I'm done jabbering at you. I really hope you take these decks seriously. Give me any constructive criticism down there in the sideboard, because I am actually, again, a huge fan of these decks, and I'm pretty faithful, especially in the competitive one. But if you see any holes in the philosophy, again, I'm all ears. Let me know down there. But I'm done for this one, right? I think I'm done. So I guess I'll catch you cats later. I don't feel done, but screw it. I guess I am. I'm Dev from the place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.